Hey, so I wanted to cover the recent game at the Esports World Cup between Top Esports and T1. Of course, both teams have pretty much some of the strongest sort of manipulation in draft in order to gain the most advantage on the current patch. I think out of a lot of the drafts that I've been seeing out throughout the years, these are a lot of the drafts where there's a meta that's probably some of the most diverse I've seen. This is because of the fact that there's not only many priority picks that are available, but there's so many different styles, both in terms of the way the game flows and also directionally in different team compositions that are viable. I don't think there's too many metas where we see poke be viable, front to back be viable, dive be viable, and there's different tempos also available. We usually see things where there's one just objectively good style, and maybe there's some down points where people are getting bored of like, oh, I'm tired of seeing Gorky Triss come out 40 times in a row, like in this game here. But such is the design of the current features of draft in League, and this could be resolved with Fearless Draft. But on the current system and the current patch, I think it's a very unique and appreciable sort of drafting dynamic. And it really challenges teams to not only come up with these picks, but also come up with different styles and challenges their play styles in order to come up with that. So I wanted to see how this game evolves and kind of explain why this draft was so pivotal on a couple of specific picks. And it's really, really close for the most part, except where, let's say, a team forgets to ban one thing, or a team does not realize they have a specific counter pick. And it's really good in these cases where when all of your players are so good, that's what basically pushes you across the edge. So, starting with this game one. Spoiler alert, this is the one game that Top Esports actually comes out on top here, and this could be because of just a very slight fumble in terms of T1 not gaining enough advantage in terms of their picks and not realizing that they ended up in a chain in their flowchart draft-wise that they did not gain any advantage. So these first three picks, I would say it's nothing too crazy. It's just a difference in terms of what they prioritize and what their bans are. Game one is very often just a feeler in terms of what a team sort of prioritizes. And you can kind of see it with Top Esports. They don't want to have that sort of normal control type of style because it seems that they just don't want to. I find that a lot of players against T1 and Faker specifically, they don't like doing that. They like to cause more chaos, and that's where they gain more advantages. So Top end up going for that and go for a more aggressive route. They play the Triss side of the Gorky Triss matchup, and they're playing for a lot of advantages here. They got winning mid, they got winning top. They're going to pick AP jungle on 4-5 for sure in order to match, and their draft is pretty much set. But as you can see here, they pick 3 laners already, but the problem is they also probably have 3 winning lanes. And in professional play, most of the time when you have 3 winning lanes, you're basically, it doesn't really matter what your comp is because you can transition it and make your comp better by getting advantage through objectives and forcing plays. So that's why it's so coveted in a lot of the cases. And this is probably just like an oversight by T1, and they didn't realize that Top would end up shifting the draft in this way. They have okay responses. A champion like Ashe has no bad matchups per se, so it's kind of hard to really come up with a counter, so you end up just minimizing it, and it kind of makes sense. Top end up realizing that they basically have all the setup they need in order to kind of provide resources for their carries and their strong laners in order for them to thrive. So Braum, in order to ensure the safety for the Ashe, and the Ivern is a really good combo with the Triss as well. AP jungler is slow scaling and basically checks all the boxes, right? At this point, when you have 3 winning lanes and you just have all that set up and your comp is as flexible as what the one Top can do, then it's pretty much hard. T1 opt to save support for R5 here, which is normally pretty decent, but the problem is it's with a pick like the Bard, its champion identity is a little bit diluted. The logic makes sense because, let's say in a vacuum, when you see Ashe Braum and you're playing a front-to-back scaling AD carry, a champion like Bard makes sense because you want to apply pressure on other parts of the map because your lane is not going to be very eventful anyway. The problem with this is that Bard's pressure is not going to be that useful. The best thing that you could argue that he would be able to bring to the table in this case is being able to kind of alleviate pressure from Zyra and prevent Tien from just really dominating Owner's jungle and having the laners help do that. The problem is, even if Rocaria were to roam, he doesn't really have that much pressure against things like Renekton Tristana, and even if he were to pull up, it would be hard for the laners on T1 to pull up, and that's where they most likely get choked out here in the mid game, and it leads to the slow bleed that I was talking about before. So it basically by the R5 point, one, they end up giving a lot of priority picks that end up costing them a lot of early game, and two, their answers on 5 end up being a lot lower than lower outcome than they probably anticipated, because when they get to R5, they're like, wait, there's not really much we can pick. The probable best thing they could go for is something defensive, like an enchanter that they were considering, and hopefully be able to outscale as well, which wouldn't be a bad idea, but again, they would have the same issue of not having any pressure on the map. So those two factors made it a little bit of a catch-22 for them, and it's kind of good on top for them to realize and pick up on this. You don't normally just blind pick all 3 laners. Moving on to game 2, this is very comfort zone for T1. They just make the appropriate adaptations. So Trist is banned, they choose blue. They're a team that likes to take advantage of the B1 pick, and I would say very standard bans for the most part, except that the fact that Rumble is left open. A lot of things are very priority in this case. I think T1 just banned Senna the entire series as well, so just as a keep in mind. This is not necessarily because Senna is the best champ in the world, it's more so to establish the dynamic in laning phase. So when you think you're the better bot lane, you never want to let something like Senna go through, because it's a skill diluter. So Gumayusi and Keria have some of the most creative picks, and they can gain a lot of advantage in a lot of matchups because of that. So you want to enable that as much as possible. The Trist ban basically trades the Corki ban, because you don't want to give the Corki B1 without the Trist matchup change. So this is the answer that top, or the route that top wants to go for. This means that T1 get Rumble out of B1, and this is where it gets a little bit spicy. So top just raw dog slam R2 Yone. And I was trying to think about what the logic for this was. This could have been a hedge as to disincentivizing certain picks from T1. Like if he's basically daring T1 to pick, like, hey, if you want to pick Azir, you could, but it looks pretty bad here. You know, I'm going to get that good matchup. Or you can pick another control mage, but I'm going to be able to do so. But it's a little bit risky because you are just blinding Yone. Like, I don't think that needs to be said, but like when you're blinding a champion like that, obviously you can leave your matchup to some manipulation, and you kind of give a lot of information about what options your team has in terms of how you want to play the game. In which case, this is basically forward. T1 can basically counter with more value version of forward, which they semi-opted to here, or they can play backwards, and they can still lean into picks like the Braum or like the Renata. That's pretty powerful here. So top can also easily just avoid this if they're going to pick Cassante into Rumble anyway. So if you go Maokai Cassante on 1-2, then they probably wouldn't have revealed it much, and then T1 can pick aforementioned Azir or Orianna or something like that, and then they can slam Yone, and then it's actually higher value that way. So that's why I was a little bit confused on this R2 pick. I like the bans on the second side from both sides. Basically, it's classic, like they've identified what the win condition is and they're banning champions against that. So Leona, very priority support right now. Kai'Sa has been pretty up there with the ADCs in terms of forward ones as well. And top end up going for a little bit of a funny with the Ezreal blind. And it kind of gives a little bit of confusion on my eyes as to what their comp wants to do, which is totally fine. But T1 end up just taking some of the best in slot remaining AD carry combos with the Kalista Renata. So overall, you can kind of see like it's a small fumble from top, but that's why game 2 looks much more favored for T1, because top is just giving them a lot of free info, and their responses are a little bit weird in terms of what they can do in order to answer these T1 options. Game 3, I believe it's around here, and I think the interesting bit here is that T1 opt to do a mismatch for the Corki matchup, which is very interesting. So they are not willing. I believe they're only willing to play the Trist Corki matchup if top plays Corki. I don't think they like the. I don't think they like the side where Faker plays Corki. So they don't want to take that chance, and they know if they leave both up, they're just going to end up having to deal with Tristana. And they, based on how the pacing was in game 1, they made that adaptation. They're like, either we ban both and lose 2 bans, which is a little bit scary, or we just let Corki through. And they've opted to let Corki through. because if you ban both, they get Rumble. It's probably pretty hard for Zeus. I don't think he's really much of a weak side laner, and he doesn't really like doing that. So if you pick Rumble and you pick a champion, it's a little bit too rough, I would say. Renekton basically still does that, but he's a lot more stoppable, let's put it that way. You can dilute him a lot better. You can pick some champions that in some matchups that you can actually deal with, but Rumble just has too much damage in his current game state, so totally understandable. T1 opt to also pick the Azir into the Corki. It's a slight counter, self counter, but it's like pretty okay. I'm sure Faker has been used to trying to pilot a matchup like this, and they were pretty prepared for this situation. Keep in mind here the Gnar ban as well. I believe this might have been something very specific, or it could have opened the gates for the Renekton pick, but there's definitely a lot of options here for T1 regardless. So where top ends up fumbling here is in second phase bans. So I would say overall it's not a bad draft. They pick the Corki priority, they follow up with Zyra Renekton. It's really not that bad at all, right? You get a lot of priority picks, and T1 have been responding. They take the Ashe priority as well, so they secured a lot of pressure on bottom side. Top, they end up going for an aggressive route, and which is fine, but there's not many options that you end up countering into the Ashe, so it depends on what the team wants to go for. The problem with this is that I believe that they were a little bit disrespectful in the bans, so they ended up banning Kalista Braum, and then they all in with a forward option. But the main two backwards options are, at least in terms of viability, are Braum and Renata. So you should probably just ban both, and they didn't. And I think this is where they get punished here, because not only did they go for the Nautilus with Leona banned, they also end up self-countering, almost like, it's not self-counter, but it basically is, because you know that carry is going to pick Renata in order to counter on R5, so it is a self-counter, in my opinion. So that's just one ban, and I think like it just gives so much more room for T1 to play on bot side. They can dilute top side, and it makes it so much more playable. Last game. So basically top, they just like nuked the entire draft. In my opinion, this is a little bit of like a misread as to what was the problem. Like, I don't think these champs were the problem per se. It's just like the context surrounding them that made them look stronger, but it ends up costing TES 2 bans anyway. So it's a little bit of a funny. And then in this game, T1 ended up going Rumble Sejuani. Understandable, because when you're backs to the wall in a game 5 scenario, you gotta try something different. They take the Corki advantage again, because T1 are just willing to play it out, and they ban Azir this time, so there's a little bit of an adaptation. However, this is where the Faker Yasuo comes in. And this is where I mentioned that you can come up with, I've been talking like a flowchart right now, right? In terms of like certain logic, like under these conditions, if this is gone, then you can go for this, and this makes sense. But how about you throw the logic out the window and you cook up something new? And that's what T1 did in game 4. That bet you didn't see that coming. The only exchange is the forward sort of reveal. That obviously like Yasuo can only play one way. They're not going to go backwards at this point. They set it up with the Recon on 4 as well, and they actually save 80 carry for 5, which is not very common, I will say. But it's because they wanted to hide the fact that they were going for the Xayah Recon combo, which is actually not too bad. I think it's pretty solid here. And like, there's not much that you can do. You could have, like, quote unquote, you could have picked Nautilus or Alistar to support the Yasuo as well. I believe that was what they were going for here. But when they see Ezreal Leona, there's only so many options you could go for. I do think Alistar would have been fine, but it depends on what their team's preferences are in the meta, and Xayah Recon actually arguably gets priority over the Leona here. So overall, the name of the game is like whoever can adapt better. And I think in this case, it's got to be T1, right? You can see just a little bit. T1 where it wasn't that big of a difference, but in those key moments, it's like 1 to 2 certain picks per game, or just you missed 1 ban or 2 bans, or like, you put pressure in this scenario, and that's what T1 gets advantage. It's a little bit in order to get priority, a couple waves to get objectives. This is basically what the highest level of drafting is. You can't leave any room for error, and I really wanted to point that out in this series, and you can kind of see that. So very conscious decisions made by both teams. Very interesting ones, and although I think it was pretty high quality drafting for the most part, you can kind of see in each game just a glimpse of why T1 was managing to get that small advantage that they needed to push them over the edge and to help them win out in each game. So hopefully this was insightful to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.